Welcome, everybody. I'm going to just get started. And we are really excited to bring this conversation to you today. We are all in the virtual conversation space, and we're getting used to that now. But we are really excited to come together and bring a number of folks into the conversation to have a chat about how the immigrant community is being affected by this COVID-19 pandemic. I'm just here to welcome everybody quickly. My name is Shayna Tabak. I'm the Executive Director of the Tahirih Justice Center here in Atlanta. And our goal today is to explore multiple angles of how COVID is impacting the immigrant community and various angles in the struggle for justice. So in order to do that, in order to build that conversation, we thought we would bring together representatives from 3 different organizations here in Atlanta and working across the Southeast with different approaches to bringing human rights and justice to the immigrant community. First, we have the organization Project South, represented by Azadeh Shahshahani. The organization Project South specifically focuses on advocacy and bottom-up movement building for social and economic justice. And in the immigrant space, specifically works a lot, and Azadeh is going to talk with us about this, around advocacy and movement building around immigrant detention and conditions in detention centers across the Southeast. So that's the advocacy angle. We also have brought Amilcar Valencia from El Refugio. El Refugio is an organization based in Lumpkin, Georgia, where Stewart Detention Center is housed. And Amilcar is going to talk a little bit more about Stewart Detention Center, I'm sure. But El Refugio's work is to provide radical hospitality and visitation and fellowship with detained immigrants at Stewart Detention Center. And they also do amazing work doing outreach and education, advocating for justice for immigrants and their loved ones. And then finally, we have the Tahirih Justice Center, which of course is our organization. The Tahirih Justice Center is an organization that provides legal and social services, direct services, to immigrants who are survivors of gender-based violence. So we work with folks who have gone through trafficking, domestic violence, forced marriage, who are persecuted on account of their gender or their sexual orientation. And we work both with the detained and the non-detained population. So our supervising attorney, Shelly Anand, is going to speak about our work representing those immigrant survivors of gender-based violence. So with that, I'm really pleased to pass it off to my friend and colleague, Jill Savitt, to give us some context and kick off the conversation. Thanks, Jill.
Great, thank you, Shayna. I'm Jill Savitt, the CEO and Director of the National Center for Civil and Human Rights in Atlanta. And I'm delighted to welcome you all to this Lunch and Learn, Immigration Amid COVID, and thanks to everyone for joining us. I'm also just delighted and honored to be with our expert panelists today to talk about the impact that COVID is having on immigrants and asylum seekers, the community that was already severely at risk for a number of reasons, and that the pandemic has just exacerbated the risks and harms they face. Shane already introduced our folks. So just a little note of housekeeping. We're going to do this in a round robin. I'll go to each of our experts individually. We'll do that for about half the session, so for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions from those of you who have joined us. I thought we could start off very briefly with a few visuals. Last November, the Tahirih Justice Center and the National Center for Civil and Human Rights took a group of leaders to the U.S. southern border, to El Paso, Texas, and Ciudad Juarez, Mexico. We were trying to get a firsthand look at the situation affecting asylum seekers at the border. The center had planned to do an exhibition on this topic, not about COVID, but about the situation facing immigrants and asylum seekers. And so we took a bunch of photos and videos, and our exhibition was going to be mounted in this month, but unfortunately we have to delay that because of the virus. So I just wanted to show a couple photos from the trip. This is the Otero County Processing Center. We could have the next one. This is a look at how immigrants and asylum seekers have camped out on the street. And as soon as the virus hit, my thoughts went to these families who are on the border, to have a virus go through these makeshift refugee camps, and just the unbelievable fear and sickness that folks who don't have access to sanitation or clean water are facing on the streets of Ciudad Juarez and in the detention center. Just really reminds you of the human dimension of this. Maybe the next slide. I'm not sure how many. These are just the makeshift camps of people who have either tried to go across the border and get asylum and have been told to wait in Mexico, people waiting here for 6 months, 9 months, a year, and you just see the unbelievable conditions that people are in. So on that front, I wanted to talk about the conditions that people are facing in detention, and maybe Azadeh, we'll start with you. What are the conditions for people who are right now detained in ICE facilities, especially if you could here in Georgia? I think you're on mute, Azadeh. Azadeh, I think you're on mute.
Okay, yeah. Can you hear me now?
Great. Yes, great.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for having me. Again, my name is Azadeh Shahshahani. I'm with Project South. We are a social justice organization based here in Atlanta, and we work with grassroots organizations and folks across the U.S. South and the global South to push forward social justice movements. And so we've done a lot of work in terms of documenting the conditions at immigration detention centers, specifically in Georgia, and we'll talk more about the corporate nature of these places later on. But in terms of the conditions of the 4 immigration detention centers here in Georgia, they're awful. Just one indication is that the Stewart Detention Center in South Georgia, which is the second largest immigration detention center in the country, is a deadly facility. There have been 5 deaths just in the past 3 years, the 5th of which unfortunately happened just this past Sunday. A young man, the 34-year-old Mr. Santiago Batten Oxlage, died of COVID-19, of complications related to COVID-19. There have been 2 suicides at this facility, with men with mental health issues were being placed in solitary confinement for prolonged periods, and they hung themselves. So, when we talk about the impact of the pandemic on the facility, we need to have a clear understanding of what the conditions were prior to the pandemic. Again, the deaths, lack of proper hygiene, overcrowding, the food that's not edible, and the water that's oftentimes green, and abusive language used by guards. And that's why we've been calling for this facility, as well as the other ones, to be shut down for several years now.
Yay. And is there any equipment provided people, any masks, any kind of PPE provided to people, Azadeh? I think we're having...
Yeah, it took a long time for it took a long time for ICE and the private prison corporation that runs the facility, Core Civic, to do anything. It took a lot of advocacy for them to finally provide people with masks, but for a long time, not the detained immigrants nor the guards had masks or any types of protective equipment. And so as a result, we have a high number of infection within the facility, as well as the guards. Just a couple of weeks ago, the numbers of infected guards were about 44. I'm sure it's much higher now.
Okay. Amilcar, I'm going to move over to you. So your organization, you have this hospitality house that provides support and lodging to families who come to visit their detained loved ones. social visits have been canceled. Can you communicate with the folks in detention, and what do you hear from them if you can?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. That's an important question because, as you mentioned, social visits in all detention centers across the United States are canceled. That happened in March 14, so it's been more than 2 months. Visitation, social visits canceled, so nobody is able to go in and visit their loved ones. Like family members are not allowed, and that's understandable during this pandemic. However, this represents a big issue for just access to the information inside of the detention center, or for the people inside to have access to from the outside, from community organizations like Refugio, Break South, and others that are providing support to detained immigrants at Stewart. The main communication channel that people use is the phone. So the phone calls are people still allowed to receive phone calls. I had to say that there have been issues with that as well. Some folks are not being able to reach their loved ones or just in general make phone calls, or there's limitations on that. Recently, there have been some lockdowns on the facility because people, as they mentioned, there are a lot of issues inside of the detention center. People themselves, when they peacefully protest, they're met with force by the facility staff in the detention center. And they use some other tactics to cut access for phones or cutting access for for anyone who is trying to support people in detention. So there have been issues with the phone. That's the main way in how people are communicating with us and their family and other loved ones. We also get letters from people. What we are hearing, and is not different than we hear in the past, as they mentioned, Project South and many organizations have been advocating for the closure of detention centers in Georgia because of the inhumane conditions inside of the detention center, and in general just the inhumane detention of individuals. And as they had mentioned, detention is deadly. Stewart Detention Center is one of the deadliest detention centers in Georgia, and we hear conditions of food issues. There have been complaints of, because of COVID-19, they had staffing issues. So sometimes people were not getting food on time, or getting just, small portions of food. Some folks were getting like food around 9 p.m., when usually their meal time is around 4 or 5 p.m. So that's one of the issues that we hear from people in the detention center. Again, as I mentioned, during COVID-19, there is a high number of people in the facility staff that had, contracted the virus, and now is about 53 staff who are confirmed to have the virus, who've been infected by the virus. And there is the ratio for detained immigrants is different. The facility has about 300 employees, and more than 50 of them have tested positive. We know that for the official number for ICE is about 16 individuals in detention, which will basically let us know that they're just not testing people. And the proof of that is that people called us from units saying, in my unit there is 5 people, there is 15 people that had COVID symptoms, and then when we ask for medical attention, we either are taken to the medical unit, and they are told that they actually don't have anything, medication to provide to us, or it is very inefficient. A person that I spoke with said, I had the symptoms for COVID-19 2 weeks ago. I request for support. I didn't get any attention. They had to fill a request. I never received any response to my request. The symptoms went away, came back a week later. I still have not seen a doctor or someone who needs to attend me. I spoke to another person who said there is about 15 people in my units who have some symptoms. There are overcrowded issues in the facility. There was usually about 60 beds, or 60 to 70 beds in each room, in each pod. And they said some people are actually sleeping on the floor. So there's overcrowded issues in this facility. And one person said, "I don't want to die here. I'm sick. I don't want to die here."
Wow. Shelly, you have a case of a client who was recently released from an ICE facility in Folkestone. Can you tell us about that case and what your client reported about conditions there?
Sure. And again, thank you for having me and for having this discussion. My client, Danilo, he is an asylum seeker from Cuba. He and his partner fled Cuba around April of last year, where they faced persecution because of their sexual orientation. Everything from my client was fired from his job due to his sexual orientation. He was an art teacher, and he was actually sexually abused by the police. And as a couple, they just couldn't be together in public. And they came to this country together as asylum seekers and were separated at the border. If they had been able to get married, they would have been, kept together. But because gay marriage doesn't exist in a lot of these countries, they weren't able to stay together. My client was in detention for over a year. He had his asylum case here in Georgia. He did not have an attorney at the time. And he was in Folkestone and Stewart for some time prior to his immigration hearing. And as Amilcar and Azadeh have stated, I mean, even before COVID-19, the conditions were quite terrible in these detention facilities, particularly our client being a gay man. There's data showing, 97% risk of LGBTQ individuals facing sexual abuse and sexual assault in these detention facilities. And that was unfortunately the case for our client, who did face sexual abuse. He had an onset of depression and anxiety, just in fear of co-detainees and officers harassing and abusing him, and he did experience some abuse. Unfortunately, he lost his asylum case, and that's when we got involved with our appellate project at Tahirih. We signed on to be his attorneys on his appeal to the Board of Immigration Appeals. And he was at that time transferred from Stewart Detention Center here in Georgia to Alamance County in North Carolina, where ICE has a contract with a local county jail. And it was around that time of that transfer in early March that the World Health Organization declared the pandemic of COVID-19. So we knew that Danilo was only going to be at Alamance for 45 days. No one is allowed to stay there for longer than 45 days. It's a holding ground, really, before someone is sent into removal proceedings or deported. And we were increasingly concerned. His partner was in a different jurisdiction, was in Pennsylvania, and was granted asylum, which just says a lot. They had identical cases. He was also pro se, but because Georgia has an abysmal asylum passage rate, our client unfortunately wasn't granted asylum, and his husband was. His husband, before his immigration hearing, before our client's immigration hearing, flew down to Folkestone, and that's where they ended up getting married. And so, part of their dream was to come to this country and get married, which they were able to do, but not under those circumstances of being in detention.
Right.
I was getting calls from his husband saying, "We are so worried he's going to get sick," and they were, looking up about the number of detainees getting sick, and that's when we submitted a request for a release or a parole request. We used Azadeh and Project South drafted this wonderful, significant letter to members of Congress about overseeing the conditions in Georgia detention centers and the number of cases there were at the beginning of March. And we cited to that. In Alamance, North Carolina, he was in a room with 8 other people. He had no idea whether or not they had COVID. He said that they were exhibiting some symptoms. They didn't have hand sanitizer. They didn't have masks. Nothing of that sort. And we were really pushing to get him released before this transfer would happen. Transfer of detainees goes against CDC guidance, which expressly states that detention centers and prisons should restrict transfers unless it's a medical emergency or it's a national security threat, which was not the case for our client. He is an asylum seeker who came here to, live freely, as a gay man. Unfortunately, he was transferred in violation of CDC policy, and the transfer was very, very scary for him. It was an 8 to 10 hour drive from North Carolina down to Folkestone. He was with other immigrants who had come from the outside, so folks that hadn't previously been detained. So he had no idea what their exposure level was, no hand sanitizer, no masks. They were, even eating food. He was so anxious about eating because he didn't have gel on his hands. And then he arrived at Folkestone, and then things got worse. He was in a room. He was supposed to be in quarantine for 14 days. Coming from the outside, they let him out after 5 days. And he was in what, like Amilcar described, a room or a dormitory with 64 other people, no masks, no hand sanitizer, very little soap. The officers were not wearing masks. They had access to masks, but they refused to wear them. They said to the immigrants at Folkestone, well, we haven't been told that we're required to wear them. These are optional, things of that nature. And in fact, there was a strike at Folkestone, and our client, being a gay man and not wanting to have any issues with anyone, didn't participate. But as a result, the weekend of the strike, they were all not given food. And so he had to go hungry because of, immigrants protesting for their rights to, a safe and sanitary environment. There were 2 cases of COVID in his dormitory. There was one individual who was also from Cuba who was exhibiting symptoms and went to the medical doctor, and they heard from officials that he tested positive. And then there was very shortly after that another case. And so honestly, there are habeas petitions happening, their official bond requests. I just was really harassing ICE every day. I wrote several letters. It was ping pong between different officers and different individuals about who had the authority to adjudicate. Luckily, my colleague Lynn Pearson knew someone with ICE down in Folkestone who had helped with a previous client, and really we got him out on humanitarian parole because of this anxiety he had, and also he was experiencing kidney stones. Those aren't even necessarily special vulnerabilities for COVID-19, but because he had an attorney who could spend every day calling ICE and writing letters, he got out.
It's just amazing how much effort for one person, and then you multiply that by all the people affected. It's overwhelming. I'm going to go to Azadeh. You mentioned earlier that there's this difference between government-run detention centers and privately run detention centers. Can you talk a little bit about what impact that has on the conditions for the people in detention?
Yeah, so I don't want to give the sense that the government-run facilities are, better. Obviously, we know that the conditions at the Atlanta City Detention Center run by the City of Atlanta were also pretty bad. And had a whole report on that, documenting a whole range of human rights violations. But there are some violations unique to the corporate-run facilities, which, by the way, I believe about 72 to 74% of immigrants nationwide are now in facilities operated by corporations. Including the 4 in Georgia, are all now operated by private prison corporations. And the reason for that the violations particular to corporation facilities is because private prison corporations have the interest of meeting their bottom line for their shareholders and maximizing profit. And that oftentimes means that immigrants are going to get the short shrift, whether it's the quality of food or just supervision or staff. And one particular example is this forced labor program at the Stewart Detention Center. where the prison corporation basically forces people to do the work that they would have had to hire regularly waged employees for. And if they don't, then they place them in solitary or deprive them of life necessities. And so we're currently co-counsel in a class action lawsuit along with SPLC and private attorneys, trying to put an end to this program and holding the private prison corporation accountable. And that's happening nationwide, unfortunately. And the fact of the matter is that after 9/11 in particular, these private prison corporations realized that detaining immigrants is now a very profitable business, and they better jump in the ring as soon as possible to maximize their profit.
Wow. And it seems like what is the oversight? It's you have to sue them basically to get oversight over them. That's how you would accomplish that. How does it work?
Yeah, right. I mean, these are ICE facilities. ICE is supposed to have some oversight, but we're talking about an agency that is filled with problems itself and is non-transparent itself and lies all the time, which is why we're calling for ICE to be abolished as well. So, of course, they don't play any major or meaningful role in having oversight over these corporate-run facilities. Right. So, we have to sue them. We have to go to Congress. As Shelly mentioned, there was this letter that we issued relatively recently, so initiated by Project South, signed on by more than 50 organizations, calling on the Georgia congressional delegation to put pressure on ICE to release people, as well as the UN. So we recently filed a request for intervention to the UN Working Group on Mercenaries, specifically asking them for some type of action when it comes to corporate-run facilities in Georgia.
Yeah. Amilcar, moving over to you, how has your organization been working to support individuals to get them released from detention?
So, of course, we have joined the efforts of many advocacy organizations here in the Atlanta area in Georgia that are calling for us to act and release individuals who are detained in the Georgia facilities. It is a matter of public safety, but it's also a matter of human dignity in respect of people's rights, especially with all the violations that we have seen in the detention center throughout the years. And this has been, I think, a lot of effort has been put by the advocacy organizations in Atlanta to call, as I mentioned, the letter, the Project South led together with our organizations to call Congress, call the Georgia delegation to demand the release of individuals in detention. Unfortunately, only one Congress representative actually was able to issue a statement. Hen Johnson did it, asking ICE to actually, provide more information about how they're handling the detention of individuals, but no other person, to my knowledge, that had done it. We other organizations, we joined also the call to the Georgia Department of Public Health to investigate what's happening inside the detention center. Unfortunately, most of those calls have been unanswered. Together with SPLC or Refugio has sent a specific request for individuals who have medical conditions, underlying conditions, to be released under the PRIHAT request. And unfortunately, either El Refugio or SPLC has received any positive answer from ICE about these conditions. Those are, I would say, in terms of the advocacy things that we have been doing together with other organizations in the Atlanta area to support individuals in detention. We continue to receive calls. We monitor the conditions inside of the detention center, taking notes of the violations. We know that the food is scarce in the detention center. Sometimes people, as I mentioned, are not given proper meals or on time, or you think meals that are nutritious, or people who have diabetes are receiving a lot of carbs and a lot of sugar. So we have made our mission to deposit some funds into their commissary accounts so they can supplement their meals. We also are depositing money into their phone accounts so they can call their loved ones and keep in touch with them, and making sure that at least in that way they keep, in contact with someone in the outside. We're sending letters of support, and then we keep, doing the best that we can to raise the concerns that we hear from them and lifting up their voices.
Right. Thanks. Shelly, I'm going to shift gears a little bit. A lot of the clients of Tahirih have suffered gender-based violence. Can you talk in particular about the unique challenges women who are survivors of gender-based violence, what challenges they face in this COVID era?
Sure, and I think we have a couple slides on that as well. If Sophie, you can pull those up for me. Great. So as you can see, as you mentioned, Tahirih Justice Center works with victims of gender-based violence, not only women, but in my case with Danilo, LGBT individuals, gender non-conforming folks as well. And we have seen across the country an increase in domestic violence, where victims of domestic violence are now stuck at home with their abusers. And that has certainly been the case for our clients at Tahirih. In fact, we had one client whose abuser, there was a warrant out for his arrest, and he had left the home at one point over a year ago. And during this crisis of COVID-19, actually returned to the home with another woman and kicked out our client. And, Georgia is not the friendliest state to immigrants. That's an understatement. And again, not a friendly state to limited English proficient individuals like our clients who are, Spanish speakers and speak indigenous dialects and, come from all over the world. Our client called law enforcement and law enforcement didn't show up. And she's had a lot of issues with law enforcement not providing interpreters and not providing her with the assistance she needs. And she had just given birth to a child. So she was, a couple weeks postpartum when all this happened. Another major issue for our clients is they are essential workers, a lot of them. And so they are not able to work from home like a lot of us are doing. They are not able to, get some of the benefits that federal legislation is providing to folks that are unemployed or losing income during this crisis. And a lot of our clients are in the most vulnerable positions as essential workers in terms of getting exposure to the coronavirus. One of our clients is a health technician at a hospital, and one of her responsibilities is actually to sanitize the used COVID masks, the N94s, and yet she was not being provided with clean and sufficient number of masks herself while she was doing this work. We have another client who is a farm worker down in South Georgia, harvesting onions, and we've read, across the country, farm workers being essential workers, being mostly, from South America, and not being provided with PPE, not being provided with water to wash their hands. And then we also have a client that works in a grocery store, and again is not being provided PPE and things of that nature. And prior to my time at Tahirih, I was with the U.S. Department of Labor, and I did a lot of OSHA litigation. So a big part of what I've been doing is actually doing Know Your Rights presentations or conversations with these clients, letting them know their whistleblower rights, so that if they don't feel safe and complain about it, they can't get fired. That they know what their rights are in terms of reporting their employer for insufficient, workplace safety. Our response to the crisis has been, we're working from home, but we're working. We're really blessed that Sophie, our amazing, she's oversees development. She's been able to secure some emergency funding from United Way and the Community Foundation, and this money is going directly into the pockets of our clients. A lot of our, I have small children, and we're blessed to have a laptop and know how to access Zoom. A lot of our clients have children, and we're not able to get education to their children during this time. We were able to secure some funding to get them the necessary technology so they can educate their children, getting them, I want to give a shout out to Eileen, our social services manager, because she's just been working around the clock for our clients, checking in with them about what their needs are, food scarcity, getting them cards to go to Walmart and Kroger so they can buy enough food. We're also trying to arrange for mental health services via telehealth, because a lot of our clients are victims of trauma and we're seeing counselors and now are not able to, and that is something that's really needed for them. And then we are continuing to work on their legal cases. Immigration court, unlike federal court and superior courts, has not really stopped, in the sense that when your asylum application is due, it's due. You can't file a motion to continue. There's no kind of leniency given despite this crisis, despite the fact that I cannot go and meet with my client and get copies of their documents to get them to sign. We're having to come up with unique solutions to get their applications for relief timely filed.
Thank you for that. I want to shift the conversation a little bit and start with Azadeh, but open it up to everybody. We have seen over the past many years an increase in really dangerous rhetoric about immigrants. There's Build the Wall and the Muslim ban and all sorts of public mobilizing against immigrants, othering people who are from elsewhere and conflating them with the problem. And we now see with this virus attacks on the Asian American community. What kinds of ways are there to fight back against this rhetoric? Is there policy? Is there public education in the community? What are the clients and constituencies you serve saying about this uptick in nationalist rhetoric and xenophobic rhetoric? Azadeh, start with you.
Yeah, definitely it's dangerous rhetoric that can, lead to hate crimes, as we have seen, targeting, people of color, Black folks, immigrants, and Muslims. And, we definitely saw an uptick in hate crimes against Muslims, specifically after the Muslim ban and, the dangerous rhetoric that Trump uses on a daily basis. And so, definitely public education has a role. At Project South, we focus on working with communities of color and making sure that we are building strong coalitions. And so something we did actually right after the elections, knowing that, we as immigrant communities and folks who, work with immigrant communities cannot afford to work in silos anymore, for our own survival, frankly. And so we formed a strong coalition. We call it the J20 coalition because we planned an action around J20, and we drafted up a list of demands targeting the city of Atlanta because we wanted to focus locally. And the city of Atlanta has held itself out to be progressive and welcoming for a long time. And so, we had demands ranging from stopping the collusion with ICE for detaining immigrants at the Atlanta City Detention Center to, making sure that, homeless communities are treated with respect and dignity, and abolishing cash bail and a range of other demands. And we presented that to the city of Atlanta. And, we're still working at it, but thankfully we've been able to meet a couple of our demands after sustained pressure and years-long campaign, a grassroots campaign targeting the mayor. She finally decided to end the collusion with ICE and put an end to that hypocrisy of the city making millions of dollars off of detention of immigrants at the same time as the city was holding itself out to be welcoming towards immigrants. So I would say definitely focusing locally, calling out, self-described progressive politicians as well when they're not, doing it right by immigrants and other people of color, and building a strong coalitions, because we have to work together, and we have got to have each other's back.
Yeah. Amilcar, anything about that you hear from families of those detained about the hate that they're hearing, or the detained people themselves? How are they affected by it, this uptick in rhetoric? I believe you're on. Oh, there.
Definitely. Sorry. There is definitely, as you have mentioned, as it has mentioned, the community is directly impacted. I mean, we have seen that throughout the years, and then the immigration policies that we have is just a result of that as well. And what we hear from, in the news and from politicians kind of exacerbates the situation, or it sometimes feeds on the fear, the immigrant community, and of course the attacks happen directly to the community. I would say that we have, have seen, for example, family members who, are just afraid to, go to the detention center and visit their loved ones. That's it's general fear of even do that, because themselves or are undocumented, or or also might be fear of being detained. And the truth is that if you're driving many hours, just in the state of Georgia, there are many localities that have these invisible lines that people cross through 287G programs and other programs, or local localities that are more lenient or have a direct collaboration with ICE. And people can be, detained by the local police and then ended up in the deportation proceedings. So the fear is definitely real. I guess in the detention center, we have seen it as well. As I mentioned, as Azadeh has mentioned, the language that sometimes the facility staff had used to refer to the people inside of the detention center. So there's general abuse that happened in that way, the use of force, and that's something that is kind of feeds, from that, rhetoric of immigrants are detained, immigrants in general are criminals, and especially those who are detained, are detained because of some of those reasons. And then we affirm, that people have, the dignity, and people have, can definitely, demand to be respected because they are human beings. So we affirm their dignity, and we wanted to make sure that we educate people about that, so people understand that, even if people have, documentation issues, or, even people have, committed some offenses and are, ended up in detention proceedings, the main problem that we have is a system that kind of feeds on that fear and incarcerates people. So it goes hand to hand with our broken criminal justice system that keeps, black and brown people in detention or incarcerated. Right. So I think it is important for people to understand that, people have rights, people have dignity, and we wanted to make sure that people know that. So we do education sessions, and we have this experience. I think for our Refugio, it's important for people to understand that sometimes it takes, people to go and visit. Sometimes it takes people to actually have build a relationship with those directly impacted to understand the extent of those policies and those attacks on immigrants, to make sure that people actually now, after understanding that, also become more aware of the issue in their communities, and do something to elevate the voices of those who are impacted, but also educate others who might have different views on immigrants.
Yeah. So I'm going to turn to some of the questions. One of our visitors to this has asked, I have a family member currently sitting at Stewart, waiting for voluntary departure to Guatemala, and hearing about Santiago was absolutely heartbreaking. Is there anything I can do to help in the efforts to pressure ICE to free detainees?
Yeah, I mean, I think,
Shelly, I was going to turn it to you.
I mean, all the work that, the coalitions that Azadeh has talked about, are making demands. One of the things, if there's a specific immigrant you know of there are ways to demand their release, or demand that they be released on their own recognizance, and that's literally just takes getting their A number, writing their name, and you can send it to atlanta.outreach@ice.gov. There are a number of ICE officials that can be contacted to demand an individual person's release, and just stating, hey, this person is not a national security threat. This person is, if they have an underlying medical condition, that's another way to do it. I mean, unfortunately, we're in a really difficult situation right now. Amilcar brought up SPLC. SPLC and Asian Americans Advancing Justice have ongoing litigation against Stewart and Irwin and Folkestone to get folks with underlying medical conditions released. And they, at least initially, they filed for an emergency order to get these folks released immediately. And the judges in Middle District of Georgia and Southern District of Georgia said no. And that's because ICE said, oh, we can do enough to keep them safe, which is just absolutely false. So that litigation is ongoing. But I know GLAR, I know Project South, Tahirih, we're all, we have petitions circulating, and then there's also a way to demand release individually for folks as well.
We have another question of the challenges that immigrant families are facing with homeschooling their kids during the pandemic. What have you seen and heard about that issue? Amilcar, do you want to take that one, or Shelly?
Amilcar, I can talk, or up to you.
I'll let because you probably have more experience with that, so I can fill in the blanks if needed.
Yeah, I think that the challenge, it's a really difficult challenge because, like I mentioned, they don't have a lot of the homeschooling has required Zooms, access to certain types of apps and things of that nature. I mean, a lot of school districts were very late in sending out a curriculum, and then put language on top of that. That is a major issue. And if you have a parent that's working, is an essential worker, are they home to teach you? Are they computer literate? Do our our clients can send us texts, but downloading an app and having to learn the ins and outs of some of the technological requirements to participate in teleschool, those have been major challenges. And even though we're working to give them access to that, there's a whole other component of, okay, I have a computer and I'm going to try to, and I'm going to get internet access. Now what? So, it's a huge issue, and limited English proficient families were already struggling in Georgia when school was in session in person, but now, the barriers are even worse.
Okay, another question. What happens when people cross the border and are detained by Border Patrol? What happens to that individual? Where are they taken? What's the process? If you could also add maybe how when people cross the border in a place like the photos I showed earlier, how might they end up in Georgia? What is the relationship between people crossing the southern border and Georgia? Azadeh, do you want to take that one?
I can start, and then maybe Amilcar or Shelly, you all can add. One thing we know for sure is that the conditions at the temporary holding facilities that Customs and Border Protection operates are also pretty awful. And that agency also has a record of abuses, including killings, including cross-border killings, literally shooting down a teenager who was in Mexico. And that's the type of abuse that they have not been held accountable for. Also, a teenager who was held in a Customs and Border Protection facility and had the flu was not provided the care that he needed. Instead, the officials placed him in a cold cell where he was left to die. So that's the kind of abuse we're talking about. And so, as we're calling for accountability for ICE and the private prison corporations that run the immigration detention centers, we should not lose sight of the abuses and the killings that Custom Border Protections officials commit as well.
Yeah, I will say that usually, of course, CDP has the ability to detain folks temporarily, and then asylum seekers, for example, are sent to different facilities. So there's across the United States more than 200, detention facilities where immigrants are placed. Georgia has 4 detention centers. And then you can just use, sometimes there is like a large facility like a Stewart Detention Center, sometimes local facilities, sometimes even just a local jail or the city jail or the county jail is that the one that's renting a space to immigration to hold and detain immigrants for as they wait for their process. I think it is important to say that in the past, asylum seekers in general were now routinely detained or hold for a long time, and they were able to let go and then continue the process from the outside, which is what should be happening right now. But the new policies, even not so new policies, since 1996, immigration has done these routine detentions for asylum seekers. And most of the times, we're talking about asylum seekers. I know Shelly talked about their clients are people who already been traumatized, have been already experienced persecution, violence in their home country of any kind, political, religious or other kind of violence. And they're looking for safety and protection, and they come to the United States because they think that they will find that in here. But what we're doing as a country is put them in a detention facility, sometimes for months and years, kind of exacerbating their mental situation, because of the trauma they are faced, and most of the times are deported to the same reality that they're fleeing from. The United States, especially in Atlanta, the rates of asylum seekers who gain, access to that or are released or are able to get the status is less than 6%. That's huge. It's like if you compare that with other courts across the United States, more than 40 to 46% of the folks, asylum seekers, are able to be released, but not in Georgia. And that's why many organizations are calling for these facilities to be shut down and for the immigration to be reformed. So those who are seeking protection can receive the protection they need, not criminalized as we're doing right now.
Right. Let's just dig down. I don't know if everyone on the listening in is aware that the Trump, so you were talking about policy starting in 1996, and immigration policy has changed a lot over time, but the Trump administration's policies like the migrant protection protocols and others have drastically curtailed the ability of people to reach the country. Maybe one of you could walk through some of the newer policies that have been put in place by the Trump administration, a lot of which have kind of flown under the radar for the vast majority of people. You don't hear about the migrant protection protocols, for instance. Could we have someone explain this new regime of policies that have come into being?
They are so numerous. Everything from very, very minor procedural things that were meant everything to an immigrant. For example, being able to administratively close your case in court because you've gotten some form of relief, right? That is gone. Being able to get asylum based on the fact that you are a victim of domestic violence, that is now so much harder because of this administration and the decision in matter of AB. The MPP policy that you have to remain in Mexico, it's called, colloquially, we've called it remain in Mexico. So asylum seekers, like you saw in those photographs, are forced into these makeshift refugee camps, which are very dangerous, overcrowded, unsanitary, and they are now, because of COVID, trying to delay their hearings, trying to delay it's kind of interesting. Inside the country, they don't want to delay anything. They want to deny, deport. But outside, they want to keep them there as long as possible and delay their due process rights and have their hearing. You know, there's so many attempts by this administration to curtail the rights of asylum seekers and refugees and migrants. And, you know, for example, unaccompanied minors were previously able to directly, you know, go and have a non-adversarial process to get their forms of relief adjudicated with USIS rather than having to go in front of an immigration judge. The Attorney General Barr issued a memo trying to stop that. Luckily, there was an injunction in the district court in Maryland, and so for now, we're able to send unaccompanied minors over to U.S. Citizen and Immigration Services, but that's not final law yet. I mean, the number of changes to our laws under this administration, the number of times that the AG has reached down, the Attorney General has reached down and reversed longstanding precedent under the Board of Immigration Appeals is, you know, unbelievable. We were talking about the rhetoric and this administration, but I do think it would be a disservice not to ask folks to look into the history of immigration law and how innately racist the system has always been. I mean, you had the Chinese Exclusion Act, you had, as a South Asian woman, I learned about the Supreme Court case with Bhagat Singh Thind saying that because this man is brown, he could not become a US citizen. And so just like Jim Crow and these racist laws that impacted communities of color in the US, immigration law definitely paralleled that. And so I think, you know, learning the history of immigration law and how it's been a flawed system since its inception, I think is necessary, especially for folks that are saying, well, my family came here legally. No, you know, that there was no legal system of immigration when folks were coming to Ellis Island. There were no visas and things like that. It was all a racialized category, using brown and black folks around the world for their labor and not wanting them to settle in this country. And that is the system we are working out of and fighting.
Yeah. Just because we're at our time, just if everyone could compose in the size of a tweet, one thing that you think those listening in could do, if people are moved by this, an action that folks who are listening in could take in the next week, you know, something that would be meaningful. Is there a way for people to get involved? I mean, you've just said, Shelly, to read up on the history would be an enormously important thing. What other kinds of things can people do?
I would say volunteer. So we need pro bono attorneys, we need pro bono therapists, we need volunteers to help get our clients essential things. I would say donate, you know, to all of these organizations that you are hearing about, El Refugio, Project South, Tahirih, and I would say agitate, protest, write letters, let ICE and CBP and the government hear you and say that this is not okay.
Yeah. Azadeh and Amilcar, anything to add to that?
Yeah, definitely. Everything that Shelly said. And I would also say, call your representative. You know, we really need Congress to step in and take action and exercise some oversight over what ICE is doing.
Okay. Amilcar?
Yeah. Support everything that Shelly and Azadeh has mentioned. I would just add that it's super important for us to to show solidarity to people, immigrants in our community, reach out to immigrants in our community who right now need a lot of support, especially during COVID-19. Of course, volunteer with the organizations that has been mentioned already. We are doing letter writings events so people can write letters to people inside the detention center. If you want to send books or donate for our funds so we can continue depositing money to people into the commissary accounts and phone accounts so they can continue calling their loved ones. That is super important. And educate others. I think the most important thing that I would always like to say is that we need to recognize that immigrants in general, immigrants in detention, immigrants in our communities are people with rights and dignity, and they should be respected anytime, everywhere.
That's the perfect note to end on. Thank you. Thank all of you for your expertise and for the work you do. Our enormous gratitude to each of you. And thank everyone who joined us today. Support these organizations. I think reaching out and learning more about these issues is key. Thanks to Tahirih Justice Center for organizing this. And we're glad you joined us, and continue to tune into these organizations. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.